So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first appointment of a series of web events on successfully implement zero-emission zones for freight. My name is Giacomo Lozzi, and I'm Urban Freight Coordinator at Polis Network. Before we start, I would like to give you a couple of practical information. This webinar is being recorded. Both the registration and the PowerPoints will be made available and shared with you in the next hours. I can mute everyone, and everyone is muted now, but I can't prevent anyone to unmute themselves, so please make sure that your microphones remain muted. You will be able to interact with the speakers via the chat, but I will explain this later. So as you know, this event was originally supposed to be held in Lisbon, just on these days, but yeah, you know, it's not possible anymore. But I would still like to thank the city of Lisbon for making themselves available and for collaborating in the definition of the program. Being a member of both Polis and TDA and having just launched their own low emission zone, they played an important role in identifying this topic for cooperation. Anyway, since the event had generated great interest and would have seen a wide participation, we decided to keep the event and convert it to an online format. So we have broken it into 4 appointments. You see them here in the slides. To make it more digestible and to give the opportunity to everyone to join only the parts of their interest. Why are we addressing the topic of access regulation and in particular zero emission zones for freight? Well, cities need to improve the quality of life and at the same time be attractive for citizens and business. Policies addressing air pollution, congestion, and safety directly affect the delivery of goods and services in urban areas worldwide. Wait, sorry, I'm mute. I'll try to mute. Yeah, okay. In Europe, the white paper on transport of the European Commission has established the target to reach CO2-free city logistics in major urban areas by 2030, but also from a local perspective, transport-related pollution is raising concerns due to the health implications, and several cities have taken action and implemented low and zero emission zones, also establishing a local dialogue with the private stakeholder concerns. Among other solutions, electrification of vehicles is emerging, and low and zero emission zones play a role to optimize the total cost of ownership and driving the demand and supply of freight vehicles. However, the market uptake of zero emission vehicles with the current logistics models is not yet matching the return on investment and the cost benefit criteria. So these new solutions are only competitive under very specific circumstances. So this cycle of web appointments will address the role of low and zero emission zones for freight as a tool to foster a sustainable transition from economic, environmental, and also social point of view. The webinar of today, the strategic initiatives on zero emission zones for freight, will provide a complete and coherent overview of existing initiatives, encouraging the spread of smart zero emission zones as a tool to achieve the target of the mentioned white paper. So we will start with a presentation by Sita Altschlag from the Transport Decarbonization Alliance, who will describe the activities of the Alliance and explain why zero emission zones for freight are a priority and what problems they solve and what benefits they bring. After that, Pauline Fournol from Transport and Environment will present the role of European regulation in supporting the transition towards zero-emission city logistics. Then Christina Nclea from C40 will introduce their Green and Healthy Streets Declaration to ensure that a major area of cities is zero-emission by 2030. And finally, myself and Fernando Liesa from ALICE will give an overview of the Polis-ALICE dialogue, which focuses on public-private cooperation for sustainable city logistics. Please introduce yourself in the chat and also write there your comments, questions, and references during the presentation so that we can address them to the speakers at the end of the presentations. If we are unable to complete these questions, we will put you in direct contact with the speakers after the webinar so that all the questions will be responded. Just a quick overview also of the meetings of tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. This will be quite different. Their goal is to share knowledge and build consensus around some areas of interventions to support the design and implementation of the zero-emission zones for freight. So there will be no presentations, but lots of interaction between the informed stakeholders. And you are also then expected to share your own experience there or your own expectations. So the results of the discussions, besides enriching the participants, will also serve as an input for the Polis-ALICE dialogue, the C40 and TDA guidelines, and the assured deployment strategies, and you will hear about them later in the presentations. You should already have received the Outlook invitations for these events based on what you have expressed in your registration. So please accept or reject the invitations by today, possibly, so that we can have a clear idea of how many people will attend, which is essential for organizing the interactive discussion. So finally, regarding the coronavirus and freight, we see that this emergency is revealing the public value of logistics and delivery services in cities. We are addressing this at the moment, both to identify the responses of cities and regions, companies and countries to the emergency, but also to collect opinions on how this will impact cities' priorities and work on freight moving forward. So both Polis and C40 have dedicated pages on their websites, but also in the chat, please write down your experiences and ideas so that we can continue the collection of information on this. So without any further delay, I would like to give the word to Sita to start with the first presentation. And Sita, the floor is yours. I will, in the meantime, start your presentation.
Thank you, Giacomo. I'm Sita Holzlach. I work for the Dutch government. Currently, the main project I'm working on is the Transport Decarbonization Alliance, where I'm chairing 2 of the working groups, the communities of interest, and also assisting the Dutch presidency team because the Netherlands is now the chair of the TDA. Next slide. Maybe just as a bit of introduction to those of you who don't know the Transport Decarbonization Alliance. It is an alliance of front-running countries, cities, and companies. So that is quite unique, I think, in the space, like the international space, where you have networks for cities or companies or countries. And this is really a worldwide alliance, and we aim to do 3 things. So the first is to generate traction during high international events and increase the level of ambition around transport decarbonization. The second is to demonstrate in which ways decarbonization can be achieved and benefits it offers. So this is done very much by the countries, cities, and companies that are member of the TDA. And the third is to provide a platform for action and interaction between key actors in each domain. And this is where the communities of interest come in. They're very much membership driven, so members define which communities of interest they want to be active in. Next slide, please. And to give you an idea, these are the communities of interest we're aiming to start in the next year. Some of them have already started, especially the freight ones. So those are the 2 that I'm chairing, urban freight And then a spin-off from that is the availability of zero-emission freight vehicles group. Active mobility will shortly be starting, and hydrogen as well. Next slide, please. So within the community of interest urban freight, this is actually the longest running one. It was established the end of 2018, where members came together, and at the moment we have 18 members and 3 partner organizations. And I'll just go very quickly through the slides of the things we've been doing the last year and a half. Next slide. So the first thing we did is make a mission statement and a white paper, which was launched at ITF last year, where we show what is already happening on urban freight, what ambitions could be, a methodology to get there, and many, many examples of what's happening already. And the main message of this paper is that zero emission urban freight can be done and that it's possible to start today. So that's something, there's a link there, you can have a look at the copy. Next slide. And then another thing that we found out looking at, okay, what is a problem that really needs this communal approach of cities, companies, and countries, was the availability of vehicles. As Giacomo already mentioned as well, there seems to be a bit of a gap between the demand and the need for these vehicles and the supply and the market for this. So we launched a call for zero emission freight vehicles, very much based actually on the Freeview project declaration and the call for buses from C40. And we have now collected, together with EV100, over 250,000 vehicles for this, and it's signed by about 80 organizations. Next slide. And then something that's more of a spin-off, it's not actually within the community of interest itself, but because you have front runners in meetings together and in relationship with each other, we see that spin-off projects are happening. So that's next slide. That's a bit of a context of the TDA and the community of interest. If you have any questions on that, please feel free to reach out. My contact details are in the last slide. So the focus for this workshop and this meeting is really the zero emission zones. So why is this one of the main projects that our community of interest is working on at the moment? So as Christina will mention in her presentation, there are several cities around the world that are looking at implementing zero emission zones in general, so both for passenger transport and hopefully freight. What we're seeing is that sometimes exemptions are being considered for freight because it's difficult, or because the vehicles aren't there, or because it's just a different kind of approach. So what we're hoping to do with this project is really show that don't be afraid to start with freight, and that it's actually important to start thinking about freight now if you want to reach the 2030 zero emission zones goal. So next slide, please. Just to give a bit of context. So when we think about freight, a lot of times we think about these parcel vans, like the packages and the online shopping. So this is the fastest growing segment of freight within a city, but it's actually not the biggest. And it's important, just as a bit of context, I think many of the people in this webinar already know this, but as a recap, to also really think about the other freight streams that are happening in urban areas. This is an example from a city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, but that a lot of actually is also construction, waste, and services, for example, and general cargo. Next slide. So why create a zone for zero emission freight? So I think Christina will mention more information about zero emission zones in general. And I did mention already why I think it's important to focus within that on the freight segment. So this is an example of a zone that's being announced by the city of Amsterdam. Next slide, please. And the reason why it's important to start with freight is that freight has a disproportionately large chunk of the emissions. And a relatively small amount of vehicles could actually make a very huge impact. So it's actually quite efficient to start with freight and think about freight in that way. A third reason is that it's a different kind of ballgame. So it needs a more systemic approach. I will get into that a bit later. but also things with charging infrastructure and stakeholders are very different, because you're not thinking about citizens and individuals, planning their daily movement and their cars or their bikes or walking or public transport, but it's very much a business decision that has to be made, that has to be in line with both the business strategic choices, but also the economical part of it. It has to be economically attractive for businesses to be able to do that. And within freight, I think it's important to state that it's not a means in itself, it's a means to an end. So the transport part of it is not actually the end goal. It's always someone or something requesting something that is not there and has to be transported. So sometimes within, at least I find myself doing that, within our own silo, we focus very much on the transport, and we forget that it's not something that exists by itself. There's a receiver and a requester and a sender. And then last but not least, it's important to set the targets for freight now, because companies need time to plan efficiently and avoid also disinvestments. Especially if you're talking about vehicle replacement, which is only one of the aspects, but an important one. It's important to keep in mind that the vehicles bought today will actually be on the road for the next years. Yes, so if you're planning to go to zero emission in 2030, now is the time to start thinking about freight. Next slide, please. This is just an image to show the disproportionately large chunk of vehicles or of emissions that is caused by freight vehicles. Next slide. It is important, though, to state that one could look at the former image and think, okay, so all lorries have to go and then the problem is solved. This is explicitly not what we aim to promote. This is a smaller truck than the one in the prior image, but it shows that for each of the cargo that needs to be transported by a large truck, several smaller trucks and even more cargo bikes would be needed. So it is a solution. Next slide. But it needs to be seen within the context of reducing freight traffic in general by increasing efficiency in freight logistics, and then choosing the best type of vehicle or the right mix of transport services to reach the end goal. And this could then be, a combination of larger trucks or cargo bikes or any. It will depend very much on the use case in the city. And then if the vehicles that are necessary in the city are identified, then it's important to transition these trucks to zero emission alternatives, both battery electric and hydrogen electric at the moment. So next slide, please. I'm going towards the end of my short presentation. Is, as Giacomo mentioned, together with C40 and the other partners, we are actually making a how-to guide for zero emission zones. So it gives 8 themes or chapters and case studies. And if you have not done so already, we would very much welcome your input. And also the web meetings in the next 2 days will be used as input for this document. It is a document that will be made available online on the C40 Knowledge Hub, and will also be made into a publication that will be shared during a high-level event by the TDA chair at that moment. Yeah, that's it. So put your questions in the chat and I'd be happy to answer them after all the presentations or through the email. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sita, for your very clear presentation. Yeah, as you said, please write down questions to Sita in the chat, and at the end of the presentations, we will address all of them with all the speakers. Now, I would like to give the floor to Pauline, and I will also give her the right as presenter. Yeah. Pauline, yep. Now you should be able to share your screen.
Thanks a lot. So here it is. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Pauline Fournols. I'm working for Transport and Environment. A very brief presentation for those who wouldn't know Transport and Environment. We are an environmental NGO working on sustainable transport in Europe. We are based in Brussels, but we also have 5 national offices in London, Berlin, Warsaw, Rome, and Madrid. Maybe important is how we worked. So we are only financed by public money and foundation money, and we use that money, of course, to pay partly our staff, but mostly to commission research, and then using that research to influence EU regulation. So credibility and scientific evidence-based approach is very, very important for us and in our work. It doesn't move. Oh, yeah. So briefly, the context. So of course, all of you know that CO2 transport emissions are rising, and this is especially true for logistics because historically emissions from logistics has been linked with GDP. So the more the economy grow, the more CO2 emissions from transport logistics raise as well. As Sita mentioned, this is the share of NOx emissions from trucks and vans is also very high in cities, despite the small number of vehicles. So I've extracted some numbers here, and in some of the biggest cities in Berlin, London, and Paris, you can see that it's around a third of the NOx emissions, and in Rotterdam, which is of course famous, a very famous logistics city, it reached over 60%. So at EU level, so since last autumn, we have a new commission, which is very ambitious in climate. So we've probably heard of the EU Green Deal, which sets a new ambition to decrease road transport emission by 90% by 2050. And maybe it's also interesting for you to know that the Commission will come up with a new white paper this summer to replace the current one that Giacomo mentioned. So we hope that, this will probably raise even more the climate ambition of the EU. So in this presentation, I'd like to address the role of EU regulation and how it can help cities to reach their goals of climate neutrality and clean air. So I'm going to address 4 areas of action, which are infrastructure, supply of vehicles, air quality, and low emission zones. But first, so as Giacomo and Sita mentioned, I'd like to come back on why electric vans and trucks are a clear pathway for city logistics. So the first reason, of course, is that electric is the cleanest technology, and it's not me saying that, but only me saying that, but also manufacturers. So these figures on the left are coming from Renault Truck, and they demonstrated that electric trucks actually emit 75% less CO2 than the diesel trucks. It's 8 times less noise. It makes 8 times less noise. It's of course zero pollution. And most important maybe is that 76% of city deliveries can be covered by a 200-kilometer range electric truck. So this is really important because these are the current model available on the market. And we saw some logistic companies starting buying those trucks. So for example, Carlsberg bought 22 electric trucks from Renault, AB InBev bought 3 electric trucks, 26 from Volvo. So we are in the early shift, but we see that this shift is coming. Second argument is that battery electric is the most efficient technology. So when we talk about zero emissions, so this graph on the right, it compares 4 different zero emission technologies. But you see that with the same amount of renewable electricity in the beginning, battery electricity, which is on the left, is the most efficient. So basically it means that, for example, if you compare with hydrogen, you would need 3 times more renewable electricity to drive 100 kilometers with the hydrogen trucks or vans than with a battery electric truck. So of course, it's really important to consider this when we think at EU level and the total of electricity that we need to decarbonize the economy. On this slide, I'd like to make a point on gas, because we very often hear that gas is an alternative, and some cities grant exemption for gas in the low emission zone, but for us, gas is really not a clean alternative, and this is true both on the climate aspects and on the air pollution aspects. So the graph on the left is extracted from a report we published in October, and it shows that actually gas trucks emit sometimes up to 5 times more than the lowest diesel trucks here. And this is especially true in cities, actually, because gas engines are optimized for high speed on the motorway, but not on cities. So, of course, when we talk about gas, fossil gas is not a solution because it's a fossil fuel and it emits a lot of methane when transported from the extraction site. But very often we also hear about biomethane. So this is the graph on the left. So biomethane is very good from the climate point of view, but only if it's produced from sustainable feedstock. So for example, waste, but produced from agricultural crops would be very, very bad for the environment. So this graph shows the potential of biomethane in Europe from sustainable feedstocks in Europe by 2050, and you can see that the supply of biomethane is largely insufficient to meet the demand of transport. So we don't think that it's a long-term solution. And of course, biomethane, if we are looking at the air pollution side, it has the same chemical composition of fossil methane, so it doesn't improve the air quality. And thanks to these results that start to be known, we've seen some announcement by manufacturers. So here the quote from Daimler, which is the biggest European truck manufacturers, said in November that it will stop investing in gas and it will now only invest in battery electric and hydrogen to reach climate neutrality targets. And last, the third argument for vans is that so the TCO, as previous speaker mentioned as well. So TCO for electric vehicles is already here, and that's something that should be maybe more advertised to logistic companies. So for vans, small vans, the TCO is already there for several years. We've seen some companies such as DHL. They made a presentation at one of our events a few weeks ago, and saying that for them, the total cost of ownership of electric van is already there without any public subsidy. On the right, it's the comparison for heavier trucks. So you can see that actually today, with the current price of batteries for 26-ton trucks, the TCO parity is also already here. And this is of course because the fuel is much cheaper, maintenance cost is much cheaper, and trucks drive much more. So the cost of the battery has a bit better business model in a truck than in a car. And the graph below is the figures with assumption for 2025. And you can see that there is a clear favorable conditions for electric trucks in the years to come. So this was a very brief presentation on electric vehicles, and now I will address the 4 categories I mentioned. So the first one, of course, as we saw, is the supply. So we've seen lots of companies ready to invest in zero electric vehicles, but sometimes we can fear that the supply is a bit lagging behind. So this is why the EU has adopted the CO2 standard regulation. So this regulation is really important. So one has been adopted for cars and vans. This is the graph on the left, and one for trucks. So for vans, it's a revision of already existing regulation, but for trucks, it was the first ever. So before last year, trucks were not, CO2 emissions from trucks were not regulated in Europe. So it's very good, a very big step, progressive step in this regards. This regulation, so there is targets at EU level, but also each manufacturer, according to its fleet, will have individual target to reach. And we see that it works. Like, this regulation is really driving the market, because after its adoption, we've seen lots of announcements by manufacturers saying that they will sell a certain amount of electric vehicle by 2025 or by 2030. So here in this slide, you see that the announcement of Renault to sell 10% of electric trucks by 2025. Iveco plans 8 to 10% of vehicles above 16 tons in 2025. And here again, the quote of Daimler saying that those trucks are needed to reach the target I was mentioning in the previous slide. So even though you can maybe nowadays not see all those vehicles on the road, they're really coming, and it's really planned in the business plan of the manufacturer. So those two regulations will be revised next in 2021 and 2022. and it's very likely, and at least we hope, that the climate ambition will be raised, and it will be also an opportunity to include all vehicles, because, for example, in the truck regulation you only have the biggest one, and we'd like to see also smaller trucks and buses to be included in this regulation. So the second area where the EU has competence is, of course, air pollution. So air pollution is very complicated because it's a very technical regulation and there is a lot of loopholes. And we face some problems in terms of pollution that especially comes from light duty and heavy duty vehicles. So here I will mention only 3 of them. The first one is AdBlue cheating. So AdBlue is actually a liquid which is mixed with diesel in the engine, and that lower the level of NOx emissions. But we've seen some, because of course the logistic companies is a very competitive market with very low margin, and so to avoid buying another liquid, some companies plug a device on the trucks to falsify and so that the engine thinks that AdBlue is used when it's not. So it's a way to avoiding this, and of course the result is a raise in NOx emissions. So this is illegal, but the problem is that the enforcement is made at national level, and there is a huge difference between member states. So also all cities are not, it's not enforced in the same way in all cities across Europe. The second issue is the high NOx level at low speed. So as I mentioned earlier, very often engines are optimized for when it's warm. I mean, especially diesel engines, and there is and actually when the truck starts and when the engine is cold, the NOx emissions are much higher. So here in this graph, you see the difference for all categories of vehicles, which is really striking. And of course, this has especially an impact on cities, because yeah, the engines are warm on the motorway, but sometimes in cities they're not warm enough, and the NOx emissions raise. And maybe a third example is for gas trucks. So gas trucks actually have been granted over 2 more years to comply with the European standards. So for us, we think this is an unfair advantage, because for 2 years, 2 more years compared to diesel trucks, they don't have to comply with EU regulations, so they don't have to have specific filters to filter the pollutants. So this is another issue. So the way all those issues are tackled at EU level is the Euro standard that you probably all know. So the Commission, as part of the Green Deal, has announced a new standard that will be published next year. So it's a post-Euro 6 or maybe Euro 7 standard, but for sake of comprehension, we call it Euro 7 standard. So for now, the Commission is preparing this regulation. We don't really know where the ambition will be, but we are very active on it, and we are going to publish the report in the coming days, setting our recommendations for these regulations. And maybe I can tell you the most important one is that we'll ask a clear roadmap for zero, so that is the last standard, and then only zero emission vehicles should be encouraged. The second recommendation will be that all pollutants that are harmful to public health and environment are tackled by this regulation, because now particles below 23 nanometers, so the very tiny ones, which are very harmful for health, are not regulated. Some other pollutants, such as ammonia, is regulated for heavy-duty vehicles, but not for light-duty vehicles. And especially CNG vans emit a lot of ammonia, so this is a problem. Then we'd like to fix the issue for the testing conditions, so that all possible driving conditions are reflected. And also that emission limits are met throughout the whole lifetime of the vehicle, and it's not because the vehicle is older that it should emit more pollution. So this is very important regulation, because if a vehicle is not meeting those standards, it cannot be put on the road. But yeah, it's very technical, and there is still some loopholes that we need to pay attention of. The third aspect is the infrastructure. So the good thing for infrastructure at EU level is both regulated from a regulatory point of view, but there is also a lot of EU funding available to finance this infrastructure. So the regulation is the AFI directive, the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Directive, and it's going to be revised next year as well. This is a very important regulation because it lists all the fuels that are considered as alternative. For now, there is no binding target, but there is an opportunity next year to make it binding because the Commission might change this directive into a regulation. It's important because the infrastructure needs to be deployed along this core network, which is composed of all those corridors plus 88 urban nodes, so the major European cities. So it means that also the EU money is available for those cities. And it's a large amount of money. For now, a lot of cities have benefited from it, but mostly for buses. But there is the infrastructure for vans and trucks is also available. So, I mean, if you have more questions about it, I'm happy to exchange with you after this presentation. And lastly, zero emission zones. So for now, there is of course no standards set at EU level. Maybe I think other presentation will address how a low emission zone should be set. But for us, we very much believe in this scheme. We've seen it works. So for example, in Madrid, we've seen 32% reduction of NOx. So we very much encourage that. Maybe to tell you what are the discussion at EU level about this. So there is the urban vehicle access regulation, which was asked by the industry to have some harmonized criteria. So it was a very lengthy process. In the end, the Commission only come up with a recommendation, which we thought it was a good approach because it's good to have recommendation, but then cities should be able to decide what's best on its territory. But the report has never been published yet, so we're still waiting for it. And the new commissioner, Mrs. Vălean, was recently heard in front of the European Parliament, and a question was asked about it. And she mentioned the fact that they could start looking at a more harmonized approach. So it's only, it's just to say that it's something that you probably should monitor at EU level. For now, DG Move has been very silent on the topic, but it shows that the Commission is still thinking about it, and we'll see that what comes up from that. And finally, so yeah, I just wanted to stress here the role of cities, because of course all member states have set some targets to decrease road transport emission, but cities have a very important role to play to be front runners in these transitions. I'd like also to mention the fact to recall Madrid example. So when Madrid sets this low emission zone, it prevents Spain to be brought in front of the court for infringement to the air quality directive at EU level. So it really shows that cities can be front runners in their own country to this, and that of course freight should be included in those zones. And I very agree with what Sita said before, that a clear predictability should be set to shift from low emission zones to zero emissions. And is this last slide of conclusion to recall the main part of my presentation, that for us it's very important that when designing those zones, no gas vehicle should be incentivized because they're not good neither for a climate or equality perspective. That there is a lot of EU funding available to deploy this infrastructure, and I very much encourage you to make use of it to, of course, prepare the way to shift from low emission zone to zero emission zones, and just to stress that EU regulation offers a lot of opportunity to make it happen. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Pauline, for your very comprehensive presentation. I think there are many elements that can be further discussed, and I see already some questions, and I will address them to you later on. For the moment, I would now give the floor to Christina. Niclea from C40, you should now receive the invite to be a presenter.
Thank you, Giacomo. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much for having me today to present about our Green and Healthy Streets Declaration. Really great to see so many people on the call today. So for those who don't know me, my name is Christina Mikle. I'm the Zero Emission Freight Manager at C40 Cities. And C40 Cities is an organization that gathers the world's mega cities that are committed to solving climate change. These cities overall represent 700 million citizens and 1/4 of the global economy. And these cities are actually responding to the climate crisis. And one of the ways in which they're doing that is by making bold commitments and then acting on these commitments. So one example is the Green and Healthy Streets Declaration, which was initially launched by the cities of Paris, Copenhagen, London, and Los Angeles. That was 2 years ago. And since then, we've had a lot of interest in this declaration from different mayors and cities. And currently, we have 35 mayors that have committed to this declaration. What the declaration does is to send a strong signal to the market for the need for zero-emission vehicles and zero-emission mobility options and services. So there are two big commitments as part of this declaration. So one of them is to procure only zero-emission buses from 2025, and the second one is to ensure that a major area of the city is zero-emission by 2030. So these are the cities that have signed the declaration to date. I encourage everyone to have a look in case you haven't heard about the declaration before. See if your city is on this list. It's very likely that it is. And if so, do get in touch with your colleagues or let me know, and I can put you in touch with the colleagues who are working with us on this. And I think I've already seen in the list of participants a couple of cities and contacts, familiar names. I've seen London, Berlin, Oslo, Barcelona, Rome, and Milan. So really great to see that you are all here and happy to discuss how we can better work together. So this presentation is about freight. I just wanted to highlight that the first commitment, cities are doing really well. And when it comes to bus procurement, there's a lot of progress being made. So we see in London, Moscow, and Santiago, there's more than 250 zero-emission buses on the road to date. Actually, in Santiago, the latest numbers are 386, which is really, really great to see. And we're hoping that the same kind of progress will be seen in terms of the second commitment, the zero-emission area, and the zero-emission vehicles, specifically freight vehicles that need to support the rollout of these areas. So of course, when it comes to buses, we're doing a lot already, but what do we do about zero emission areas and how can we get there and what do they mean for freight? These are all questions that we are working through with our cities. So first and foremost, the zero emission zone is all about increasing quality of life for citizens and reducing reducing emissions from transport, so both in terms of carbon emissions and air pollutants. It's about providing alternatives to cars, enabling access to walking and cycling, public transit, and shared mobility options. When it comes to freight, this is all about making freight deliveries efficient and providing zero-emission alternatives. It's an area that's a diverse area, vibrant, equitable, and resilient to the climate impacts. So in our discussions with cities, regarding what we can do to support them roll out these zero emission areas, freight has come up as a really big challenge and a really big unknown, which is why we've launched the zero emission freight program for the signatory cities of the Green and Healthy Streets Declaration. So this is a program that works with city officials, policy and industry experts to advance the transition to zero emission freight vehicles. So we have a couple of priorities. One is accelerating the commercial uptake of new and second-hand zero-emission freight vehicles and the effective deployment of charging infrastructure, because the two need to happen hand in hand. Then thinking about other alternatives for last-mile delivery, such as electric cargo bikes, portering parcels, different models that are currently being tested and used and can be scaled up. And very importantly, as Sita has mentioned as well, thinking about how the overall impact from freight can be reduced by reducing the number of vehicles on the road and the total miles traveled. So we have a couple of resources that we provide to the cities that have signed this declaration. So that includes a webinar series, a newsletter with updates from industry and cities. We also have a matchmaking option where we can try and pair cities who have similar questions or experience to share on specific topics, and also collecting quite a bit of information on different case studies and what different cities are doing. So just to give you a bit more information on who else we work with, so we have a range of partners such as CallStart, ICCT, EV100, the TDA and Police here today, and we're also part of the Zero Emission Freight Vehicle Action Group, which is championed by the TDA and CallStart, working with other organizations to support the creation of a mass market for zero emission freight vehicles. And finally, one of the most important ways in which we support our cities through the Zero Emission Freight Academy, which is a 3-day event that we organize where we bring together cities with our partners and experts. So these are some photos from the first academy that we hosted last year in Vancouver, and I think a couple of people who attended might be on this call. So the topics that we addressed were how we accommodate freight within zero emission areas, so different pilots and sectoral opportunities, accelerating the deployment of zero emission freight vehicles, deploying charging infrastructure effectively, and engaging businesses and forming effective coalitions. So as part of that, we also developed a briefing with CallStart that looks at the key challenges and opportunities for cities to advance the market for zero emission freight vehicles. And moving forward, we're keen to further expand this conversation. So we will keep our focus on these topics for the second year of the academy. So you have those on the screen. And with regards to the first topic, so zero emission area planning, zero emission zones for freight, as Sita mentioned, we're also quite actively looking to promote successful examples or showing where cities are actually leading the way. So we've started a webinar series. We've had 2 webinars already. The first one highlighted the work happening in the Netherlands. We had the city of Rotterdam, Dutch government, and the postal company talk about their experiences and insights in terms of planning for zero emission zones for freight. And in the second webinar, we had Transport for London present on their zero emission zone planning, as well as 2 projects on zero emission freight. So one on a pilot on the Newt, Mayor of London cargo vehicle trial, and then a smart charging infrastructure project, all of which will support the zero emission zone in the future. So I encourage everyone to have a look at the Seaworthy Knowledge Hub, where you can find links to these recordings. And as Sita mentioned, very happy to receive any kind of feedback and links to further resources to inform the guide that we are developing. The good news is that we're not starting from scratch. There are already a lot of low emission zones in place and different trials for zero emission zones, so we're keen to learn from those. And because we know that low emission zones, they already work, but like Pauline was saying, they're not enough. We're keen to kind of continue this conversation on how we can get from low emission zones to zero emission zones. And what we are seeing is that these commitments are already having an impact, so we're encouraging everyone to be as ambitious as you can. We're seeing manufacturers and fleets making the connections between the zero emission vehicle market and the zero emission zones being rolled by cities. So if you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to really think about what you can do in your own city today, and whether a zero emission zone is a possibility. Thank you, Giacomo. That concludes my presentation.
Thanks a lot, Christina, for presenting all your activities. It's quite impressive. Maybe just one clarification. You also presented the webinars. that we also promoted through our channels. So I think, and I hope also for the future, the new webinars will be still available for the members of ALICE and POLIS, so that we the whole principle also of this collaboration is not to overlap but support each other's, and your webinars are very good in that sense. So
yes, they will be. The series will be open.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I will now share again the screen myself to present the POLIS and ALICE presentation. I will start and then give the floor to Fernando, who will continue. No, sorry. Yes, I will start with my presentation, then I will share Fernando's screen. So just to first introduce POLIS, many of you already know it, of course, being members of the network, but there are also other participants. So I just give a general presentation. The POLIS is the network of cities and regions working for innovation in transport. We have 80 plus members from small towns to big regions, so very different types of local authorities all around from all around Europe. The current president is the city of Gothenburg, and POLIS was founded 30 years ago because as cities we saw that European legislation was implemented at local level, but cities didn't hardly have a say at European transport policies level. So that's why we funded POLIS. The activities that we carry out are mainly organized around three main areas. We have working groups that facilitate the exchange of experiences and the transfer of knowledge between European, local and regional authorities, but also the dialogue between the local authorities and other players in the sector, like industry, universities, research centers, and non-governmental organizations, like, for example, in the case of this webinar. We also actively support the participation of the members in the European projects so that they can test and research about new solutions. And we also sometimes participate in these projects ourselves. And we also maintain a continuous dialogue with the European institutions representing the voice of cities and regions. The activity of POLIS is divided into 5 pillars and even more working groups. Of course, all the topics are interconnected, but you see that the urban freight one that I am responsible for falls under the governance pillar, but it's also, of course, addressing all the other aspects of the other pillars. As I said, we encourage cities and regions to test innovative measures. We have European research and innovation projects that can help in that. Here you see the logos of a few of them that were or are currently addressing the aspects of access regulation, electrification of freight, the identification of regulation and living labs. I can provide more information about this in a bilateral discussion, but just to give you an idea, and also saying that there are reference groups from these projects. For example, many members of the Assured Urban Freight user group are now attending this meeting, because the idea is to enlarge the scope of these projects and involve also external stakeholders. So whenever you are interested in a specific topic, we can make sure that you get involved in this kind of initiatives. In terms of access regulation, the European Commission recently published a study on urban vehicle access regulation is not the same as Pauline was mentioning. This is more a non-binding guideline that was published in 2018, but it gives some recommendations that we are now supporting in our work with cities and regions, but also with the industry. So to facilitate the exchange of best practices and capacity building for cities, to make traffic information available to users in real time, increase the system's transparency, and make the information available to users and also operators, including the logistics ones, to collect data on existing schemes and evaluate their effectiveness, and also address the fragmentation of the schemes at European level. We know that there are many different regulations, but also respecting subsidiarity, so that each local authority has the right and the understanding to implement the best possible regulation for their local environment. So the idea is that cities use their power of regulation to innovate. There are many functions that are related to the provision, regulation, management of transport services, but originally it was a very strong prerogative of the public sector. Now this role is becoming more and more confused, and the private sector has always more and more a stronger role in this. For example, the new market for mobility services has seen a substantial growth of third-party operator players, and at Polis we also have, in fact, a public-private dialogue with macro mobility operators, for example. What we have seen that the technological progress has brought in many data that are in the hands of the private sector, and so they often have a better picture of what's going on in the cities. So there's the need for close collaboration with the private sector, although the public sector should maintain a coordinating role, since they have an holistic view of all the mobility services, are neutral, and also pursue the collective well-being, including the one of citizens and businesses active in the area. But that's also why we have started our collaboration with ALICE, and Fernando will tell you more first about ALICE and then about the Polis-ALICE collaboration. So Fernando, now I make you a presenter. You have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You can also see my screen, right?
Yes.
So then, thank you, Giacomo, and thank you all the presenters for the presentations. And I'm going to first introduce very briefly ALICE, and then go into the Polis and ALICE collaboration that we'll share with Giacomo. So ALICE is the European Technology Platform for Logistics Research and Innovation, and we have a formal mandate of the European Commission in defining the research and innovation program. Now it's the Horizon 2020 program, and we are in the definition of the next program that it's called Horizon Europe, that will run from 2021 and 2027. For doing that, what we do in ALICE is indeed share and raise consensus on how logistics should develop to meet challenges for people, planet, and profit. And then we also look into the evolution of the technologies and how these technologies can help Alice and the logistics sector to reach that vision. And then we also map progress of research and innovation and impact in implementation. And of course, as we are now more than 140 members organization, we also use Alice as a framework for our members to collaborate between them and to arrange collaborative innovation projects. In terms of the kind of stakeholders that we have in Alice, we represent, I think, a full picture of logistics industry, from shippers, manufacturers and retailers to logistics service providers, couriers, postal operators, freight forwarders, port hubs, intermodal terminals and transport infrastructure, vehicle manufacturers, operations, handling, other transport support services, information and communication technologies. We also have a number of good members that are logistics clusters, so that are representing similar kind of stakeholders, but at the regional or national level, and also I would say the most important research and technology centers in the area of freight transport and logistics. Not only we have as members not only the companies, but also the relevant European and international associations. So that's builds a strong network with different perspectives, and this is helping us a lot in building a very holistic approach to the problem and to the issues we need to face. So as Alice, our vision is really to go towards zero emission in 2050. At the end of 2019, we released a roadmap towards zero emissions 2050, and there we established this is not the focus of today, but you can go there, and there we made a review of the different roadmaps, but also provide a framework for companies and governments to develop their own roadmaps towards zero emission. And then how we envision this at the end, we are looking into the physical internet concept for the short term, that it's at the end bringing us, or it's in a way recognizing that moving to greener assets and renewable energy, maybe it's too slow. So then if we need to transform all the fleet, if we need to use all the renewable energy, and we need to do this in an affordable way for the companies, but at the end for citizens, this is not possible if we only address this. Why it's not possible? Because if you see in the graph that I'm presenting, there it's a representation of the effort we need to do to meet climate objectives. So then this means it's not only important that we reach zero emissions, but also the path we follow is very important, because the sooner we start reducing emissions, the more time we'll have indeed to move towards zero emissions. So this means if we, unfortunately this is not the case, but if we would have peak emissions in 2016, we could have transitioned towards zero emissions in a more soft way than if we start doing in 2025, then we need to move into a very stiff curve. So then this means that we need to also look in short-term opportunities. So then it's important to develop zero emissions technologies and vehicles, but it's really important if we want to meet climate challenges to do other things that can be more quick wins. So that's what we are looking at in Alice. So then how we can use existing ideal capacity of assets and infrastructure in all transport modes. So then we reduce empty trips in all modes. We avoid to have low load factors. Then, in particular in cities, what we see is that although the routes are very efficient, still few items are delivered per stop, and that's creating much more traffic of what it could be necessary. Then we also see how we can find, depending on the time, very overload infrastructure, and in other parts of on other times it's on use, and this creates congestion and inefficiency. Then how we can reduce empty running, but also returns. So then there are a number of opportunities that we can or we need to pursue to reach the objective. So then our approach, and it's the concept of the physical internet, it's that we need to open and connect logistics networks seamlessly. That by the way, it's clear in this, it has been clear by within this COVID-19 outbreak how important it's to have seamless and well-connected logistics networks. So then everybody can access to goods and services. So then it has been demonstrated that we can live staying at home for 15 days, 1 month, even more weeks, but we cannot live without moving the goods. So that's also an important message. So then in this framework, for us, it's very important to collaborate with those stakeholders that are not as part of ALICE, and that's why we are collaborating with Polis. And then I'll start with the presentation, common presentation on cities and industry dialogue. And first of all, as part of the big community within cities and ALICE, here you have the different organizations involved from both Polis and ALICE. So then we have a good representation of stakeholders. So for us, the common vision and objective is to lead transformation in cities. So urban freight and logistics is responding to pollution, congestion, safety, and environmental challenges. It's very important for us that we do this, address this in an holistic way, because if not, we miss boundary conditions that are at the end very important to achieve the objectives or not. I'm hearing a lot of noise, so then if you can mute yourself. And then as the objective, it's in a way to accelerate deployment of solutions towards sustainable zero emissions, urban freight and city logistics. And it's how cities can help industry in doing this, but also how industry can help cities in doing so. Because sustainable is, of course, environmental, but also economical. And I see in some of the topics that we discuss, maybe we miss more the operational part on how to make these efforts happen. So then the approach is that we compile, share, and discuss measures, practice, policies, and experiences. So then we can learn from each other. We can understand how to take up the best practices, scale them, and replicate them. Then also building consensus, and because it's clear that it's not always that we agree on everything, but we need to identify why we are conflicting and which are the different points of view. So then we can frame better the problem to solve. Then, and this is what it helps us to identify the remaining gaps. And then also we have some common points of agreement and targets, so then that we share and spread, like in these presentations, but also we will discuss this in the webinars and web meetings tomorrow. And of course, with the objective of speed up innovation implementation, but also with the remaining gaps to provide directions to the Horizon Europe program, but also to the research and innovation programs of different member states and also of industry. In terms of activities, we are currently, we started the cooperation at the end of 2018. And last year we shared best practices and we start meeting each other and understanding the different drivers and interests, and but also positions. So then I think we know each other quite well now, and then based on this, we are in a good position to draft a position paper with the main focus points, key messages, SAR principles, and so then we can hopefully provide direction to cities, regions, industry, and European institutions. And we do this through web meetings, but also physical meetings. Now it's complex physical meetings, but we are changing these physical meetings by web meetings, and it's working quite well. And of course, we continue doing best practices compilation, and not only compilation of those best practices, but understanding what's the reason for those practices to be best practices. And that's why we rely very much in our members, because have the deep knowledge on these best practices and which are the key factors for those to be best practices. So the joint document have different parts and different elements, but here today we would like to highlight this map in which we try to gather different solution areas and interventions. We have a smart governance and regulation that, of course, these are city lead. Then clean and alternative fleet, that this is more the OEMs that need to lead this part, and also urban freight and logistics operations that are more the freight transport and logistics operators. But here the important thing is that although there are different solution areas and interventions, the important part of our dialogue is that we are doing this with the support and, as I said before, with the help of the different kind of stakeholders. And then we have two transversal areas that we think are key, that are the data. So then purpose-oriented data acquisition, but also people engagement. So it's how we engage with the people that at the end are the receivers of all this effort. So just to put in this a little bit into context, I think Giacomo, maybe you can go through this slide yourself.
Yeah. So the idea here, just to very briefly make an example of how we translate this scheme into practical work. So in the case of zero emission zones and for smart governance and regulations, we have come up with both sides of our memberships to some shared key principles and messages. For example, in order to spread the word and the implementation of zero emission zones, it's important to develop implementation principles for replication, and in this sense we also actively support the guidelines that TDA and C40 are drafting, and we are providing our feedback on that. Then it's important to develop a baseline for emissions in cities in order then to use a set of indicators for monitoring the progress and the effectiveness of the schemes. So it's a recommendation for cities. Also, the incentives, subsidies, and restrictions are required to speed up transition. We had this dialogue and we discussed about partnerships and cooperation, but it's very important to have regulation in place, as you also saw from Pauline's presentation. Then you have regulation, but you also have to enforce it in order to make sure that there's a level playing field for everyone. And yeah, maybe the most important thing is to involve all the stakeholders to distinguish the typologies and flows and needs. I see also in the chats there's already debate ongoing about different typologies of stakeholders and what are their needs regarding the vehicles. So that's a starting point as well for us.
Thank you, Giacomo. So then for me, the other vision is from the clean and alternative fleet. And here our vision is that at the end, it's very complex to solve the different kind of flows and needs and services. Is very different to talk about courier or parcel delivery compared to deliver to a store. And even delivering to a store, it's very different for small stores, convenience stores, to big stores. So then at the end, there are a number of different types of flows in the cities. And we think there is a need for a smart combination of vehicles, from heavy trucks to cargo bikes, and indeed to have very straightforward solutions. We don't think this could work for everything. There are not the silver bullets here. So then we need to do a smart combination of the kind of vehicles, but not only on the vehicles. It's also on the fuels and energies, because we'll address this from the user's perspective. It's very complex because it's not the same capabilities that provide an electric truck than compared to a hydrogen truck, for example. And if we want to move to zero emissions for some applications, it's not obvious that I don't share that for every single operation, electrification it's much more efficient, because for some solutions now it's even not possible. So then I think we need to look into this from a very holistic point of view, and understanding what fits better for what. So then in particular, and this is very important, and this it's very clear from the presentation of Pauline, that for electric trucks or electrification, and to have a positive TCO, we need to use them extensively, and this is also linked to the use cases. If we manage to use them extensively, then the business case is it's much more convenient. So that's a very important point. And then also, as I said before, from an holistic point of view, we need to understand when and what we need to transition, and also referring to the presentation of Sita, if we move out for trucks, then we may create other problems in congestion. So at the end, the result is not as good as we could expect. And in doing this, it's also something that we are heavily discussing between Polis and Alice. We need the most we can harmonize the definition of type of vehicles, accessing the zero emissions or ultra low emission zones. It's better because for our industry, getting to economies of scale and economies of implementation, it's making this more efficient. So at the end, this is also part of the cost. If you need a customized solution for every neighborhood or every city, this is much more costly than having solutions that could be broadly implemented. And that's why this is so important to accelerate the transition. Absolutely agree that we need to adapt and ensure e-charging infrastructure. It's a system perspective that is needed. It's not only the availability of vehicles, it's also how they can operate from a system perspective, and also how this relates to the noise and could enable other operations, for example, at night. So then that could also help. And then last but not least, it's from an urban freight and logistics operation point of view, I think it's for some use cases, it's clear there is a business case now, but for others, it's not that much. So the question is how to make zero emission zones irresistible for companies, how you create the framework. It can work. So it's really important. If we want to speed up and accelerate transition, we need to make it irresistible. And irresistible means that it needs to be a clear economic case behind the environmental case, and then this would of course accelerate. So then we need to look into this, and it's not only an issue on cost, it's also an issue on autonomy or performance. So for example, the problem of electrification, it's for heavier trucks, is the autonomy, but also performance, so how we can deal with the slopes, and even, as I think Nerea said, yes, what about refrigeration or frozen that requires more energy? So then that's why we need to be open in the kind of solutions, so then we can overcome cost and autonomy. So that's why we need innovative concepts and services for zero emissions urban logistics. So then how, if autonomy is a problem, how we can move platforms and hubs more to the cities, but how we can make this work from an economic point of view, from real estate. But also there are other opportunities if we can move to night of peak deliveries, where we can do more operations maybe with the same time. So then we can increase the TCO. And these are the main messages we wanted to bring. And for the discussion tomorrow, for those attending the Urban Freight and Logistics, we will ask you for solutions to solve the cost and autonomy performance. We'll ask how to get platforms and hubs closer to the inner city, and how to get collaboration happening to restructure the flows. Because if we, it's clear that with the current business models, it's complex to get the right case for zero emissions. So then we need to combine flows, we need to collaborate, we need to share, and that's part of the physical internet concept, and we'll discuss this tomorrow. So then all this, it's input for the Horizon Europe program, as I said before, and both Polis and Alice are part of this partnership towards zero emission road transport. That will be a partnership within Horizon Europe 21-27, and we expect this partnership to be a good support for accelerating the development of zero emission zones and solutions in cities. And then now I think it's the time for who is addressing this, Giacomo?
Yeah, then thanks, Fernando. Yeah, just to conclude on that, say that at the Polis conference this year in December, it will take place in Arnhem-Nijmegen city region in the Netherlands. We will launch a Polis Alice position paper that with points that you have already seen here, further developed. And I don't know if Arnaud is online. I would like to ask him to briefly mention what's going on there. It's from the city of Arnhem. No?
Giacomo.
Yeah, it's Gert also. It's also fine.
Yeah. Well, Arnold is in charge of this this work, but I'm stepping in for him, and yeah, the idea is that we ask. Hello? Oh, daar is Arnold. Hi.
We don't hear you good, Arnold. No, it doesn't work. Maybe Gert, you can take over.
Yeah, I'll try briefly. The idea is that during the Arnhem Nijmegen Polis conference, of course everybody is invited to our city. One of the things we want to do is to give the opportunity to city and regional political representatives to engage in the dialogue with EU representatives. So there is a call. I think it will be circulated later But just to mention it now, a call also for political representatives to attend the conference and to give a presentation around certain issues. It's not only freight zones, but that's definitely part of it. But there are many other issues as well. So it will be circulated later, but be aware that we are looking for political representatives to attend this meeting.
Thanks, Gert. Thanks a lot. So yeah, we are almost at the end. I would like, to ask some questions that have been asked during the presentations. I would start from Sita to go back again. So from Charlotte de Brou from the city of Brussels, the question is, what should be the right size for a zero emission zone to have a significant effect on air pollution and CO2 emissions, if it's just a neighborhood or a whole city? And also from Louis, I don't know from where, but he's asking what's the role of national policies to foster the decarbonization of urban freight transport?
Yes, thank you, Giacomo. So for the first question about the size of the zone, I think it will depend on the city, and that's a bit of a maybe an unsatisfying answer. I think the idea of what we're seeing now within the best practices is that the ambition should be that it's the largest possible zone, and possible being defined, I think it also came back in the presentation from Pauline. What is the size of the enforcement that is reasonable? What is the size of the predictability? So what can you actually request? I think Fernando also mentioned that you have to make the least exemptions possible. So if you make the zone too big and then you have a lot of exemptions, that's not something you would want. But if you make the zone too small, for example, just a commercial district, then that doesn't have the effect that you need. So what we're seeing at the moment, at least within the case study of the Netherlands and the other case studies, is that we're seeing differences in approaches there. London, for example, looking very much into the commercial district, and then freight being part of the larger zero emission zone also for people, if I understood it correctly. And then within the Netherlands, it's actually mid-sized. So it's the commercial district and the adjoining neighborhoods of the commercial central district. And what is important, especially in the narrative for example, California, is that vulnerable communities are taken into account. These are usually the communities that are not living in the center or very near the center, and that are most affected by the negative effects of the emissions. So that's something that we see happening in California, where it's very much based on the clean air. And it's actually something that also came up in Rotterdam, if I may say so, where they had the environmental zone, and then some neighborhoods actually spoke up and said, "What, we don't have a right to clean air here." And that's something we also hear in other cities and regions. So yeah, I think that the size of the zone will be defined by what's possible, also what stakeholders you have on board. If you have some ambassadors within the city that say this zone is possible, that makes it much easier to have a larger zone. And it's also important to look at the infrastructure, where we see the charging infrastructure for freight vehicles will be largely overnight and at distribution centers. It's important to look at the data within a specific city and see what is possible, where are distribution centers already in place, and where, for example, if the zone is identified, would a new distribution center be needed with charging facilities. Does that answer your question? I hope.
Yeah, there's no doubt, but
okay.
I think
otherwise send me an email and I'm happy to discuss it further. And then for the question on national policies, I think it's extremely important that the national, or at least the regional, if you look at a larger country like the United States, where regions and states are taking a lead and putting the ambition out there. So it very much helps the cities to find the framework within which they can define this zone and start implementing. So what you see in the case of the Netherlands, actually the national government within their local climate agreement or the national climate agreement made a commitment to introduce 30 to 40 mid-sized zero emission zones by 2025 in the largest cities of the Netherlands. So that is a national framework that very much helps, I think, move the discussion to how are we going to do this, and move it away from, is this something we should want? Is it, move it away from if it's something that cities should want, because the national framework states that it is something that is necessary and that the country is backing. So yeah, more on that. I saw you shared your email address, so I'm happy to share more ideas on that if you're interested.
Thanks,
just to
Sita.
keep it short. Yeah.
Thanks. For Pauline, there are many questions and then a debate regarding the vehicles and the comparison that you made, especially. The questions from Fernando, for example, is if you have considered renewable energy. No, sorry. If you have taken into account cost of local storage of electricity versus hydrogen, and also the inefficiency created by the weight of batteries. Also, there's a disagreement by Julius Menge from the city of Berlin about the pessimistic point of view on CNG and LNG for heavy trucks. This is also an open debate regarding the segment of heavy trucks, if you have looked at that. And also if from Claire-Marie Bernard, if you have considered also hydrogen for freight vehicles, because it was not included in the picture. Anyway, for then there are many other questions. I will make sure that you will get in contact bilaterally on this.
Yeah, thanks, Giacomo. Happy to answer all questions by email afterwards. To come back on the question you summarized, so for the comparison between electricity and hydrogen, I would need to check internally for the cost of storage. I'm not sure about that. What I can say is the zero emission, battery electric trucks have been granted of 2 additional tons in the CO2 in the regulation to compensate the weight of the battery. So actually, not for the trucks not to lose too much payload, they're allowed to have two tons extra for battery electric trucks. So that tackle a bit that issue. So for gas trucks, yeah, this is so for me. So I think the question was more related. So it was both on CO2 and pollution. So for gas, you need, of course, we don't only look at the tailpipe, but we look at the well-to-wheel approach. So which means that we consider the production of the fuel. And it's true that gas, when it's transported, it emits a lot of methane. And methane is way worse greenhouse gas emission than CO2. So it's worst in terms of the climate perspective. So of course, when we look at decarbonization, we look at the whole picture. We don't only focus on the type of emission. Then, so I think there was a question on CNG and LNG, and we are actually currently preparing a briefing on CNG vans that maybe it would be interesting to share also with the participants of the meeting. Yeah. I don't know all the results yet, but what I mentioned is that so NOx is one pollutant, but of course you have lots of other pollutants, and for example CNG is apparently really bad for ammonia, which is also like a very harmful pollutant. So we need also to look at the whole picture, and then I think for gas, which is important, is like biomethane is good, but it's not. There is not enough potential to power all the trucks and ships and buses that would need to drive on gas. So the risk here is like we make a lot of investment for a technology which is only a transition technology, and then we are locked in with all those investments, and that's in the end it will favor natural gas, the fossil fuel. So that's why we're very much encouraging the shift to zero emission technology as soon as possible. Okay. And for hydrogen, So yeah, hydrogen. So first, hydrogen is a bit similar. For now, 95% of hydrogen is made of fossil fuel. So electrolysis is only a very small part of the current hydrogen available. Then have this issue of efficiency. For now, hydrogen produced from electrolysis is highly inefficient because you need to transform the electricity into a gas, to cool the gas, to make it liquid, and then to go back into electricity. And in all those processes, you lose a lot of energy. But of course, hydrogen will be probably a solution for long haul, or for example, in harbor, because in harbor you have lots of renewable electricity production. So for some cases, we do believe in hydrogen, but in this presentation, because we focused on cities, I only focus on battery electric, which for us is a clear pathway solution for cities.
Okay.
But
Thanks,
happy
Pauline.
to share
I think,
happy to share all of briefings and sources of this presentation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, and I will put you in direct contact with people to further discuss. Then just last question to Cristina from Edoardo Marcucci from University of Roma Tre. So given that you are addressing big cities, what is the percentage of space that zero emission or low emission zones should cover with respect to the total surface in the cities that are participating to the program, and if and how we can expand this?
Sure, thank you for the question. I think it's similar to the question we were discussing earlier, where Sita was talking about the size of the zone. So it's hard to set a specific percentage in terms of the total surface area, but what we are working with cities on, what we're encouraging cities based on the feedback that we hear from industry and fleet operators, is that these zones need to be large in size. And there's different ways that they can be layered. So you can have a zero emission zone on as part of a wider low emission zone. But again, what we are hearing is that the zones need to be large in size so that operators can plan appropriately. They can make those investments, and they know what's coming up. And that's also sending a strong signal to industry and manufacturers to say that there is demand for zero emission freight vehicles. And we consider that if the zone is small in size and more focused on pedestrianization efforts and car light areas, those efforts are also to be encouraged. But when it comes to the potential for the market for zero emission freight, if we use this approach, then we're missing a huge opportunity to actually influence what the market looks like and to make sure that those vehicles are actually operating on our roads.
Okay, thanks a lot, Cristina. And sorry for the other questions, we don't have time to address them here, but as I said, I will write you an email to put you in contact with each other. Just to conclude, first of all, thanks a lot to all the presenters and for all of you who have stayed, even if we have run 10 minutes out of time, most of you are still there, so that's very encouraging. As next steps, cooperation and synergies, I will not go through this list, but just to give an idea that we are keeping cooperating with each other to ensure that there's a good broad impact and reduce the overlaps of our respective activities, and we are all a strong network, so we need to collaborate, and you see that there's also discussion, but we want to make sure that we have a common understanding as much as possible, not to work in silos but in synergies. For the web meetings of tomorrow and after tomorrow, as I said, it will be very interactive, so this was more about presenting initiatives. Tomorrow and after tomorrow to discuss. So I will send an email later on with the presentations and the recording of the meeting, and please again accept the Outlook invitations if you can come in the next days, so we have a clear idea and we can organize the discussion. Having said that, I thank you, all of you, for your patience and participation in this period, and stay healthy and safe, and talk to you soon. Have a nice day.